beautiful, but what does it mean?
It means our destinies are intertwined.
I'm ready.
Look, the light reveals the truth.
It's beautiful, but I'm free.
Fear not, it binds us.
I'm so scared of losing you.
You won't, I promise.
But everything feels so uncertain. This light feels so fragile.
As long as we are together, it will shine.
But what if it's not enough?
It will be.
She didn't steal a ring. She stole a declaration. She just didn't know it yet. One desperate girl. One moonless night. One ancient seal that had waited centuries for the wrong, or maybe the right, pair of hands. And one alpha king who felt it the moment she touched it. He didn't send guards after her. He came himself. Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, you came on the right night, because this story is going to stay with you. Today's story is called The Alpha King's Stolen Seal, and it is the kind of tale that starts with desperation and ends with something you didn't see coming. If you love werewolf romance, possessive alphas, girls who fight back, and love that sneaks in through the cracks of survival, then stay with me, because this one has all of it. Grab something warm. Get comfortable. And let's begin. Sera had learned very early in life that hope was a luxury. Not the kind you bought. Not the kind you prayed for. The kind that sat quietly in your chest and waited for the exact wrong moment to whisper maybe this time, right before everything collapsed. She had stopped listening to that whisper a long time ago. So when she lay in the softest bed she had ever slept in, inside the most beautiful room she had ever occupied, behind walls that smelled of cedar and old power, she felt no gratitude. She felt the shape of a cage. It didn't matter that the cage was lined with silk curtains and scented candles and a window that overlooked a courtyard full of winter-bare silver trees. It didn't matter that the meals were warm and the servants were polite and no one had raised a hand to her in 3 months. It mattered that the door was not hers to open. It mattered that when she asked, the first week, politely, then the second week less politely, then not at all, where she was being taken, what she was being held for, when she could leave, the answer was always the same. A slight dip of a head. A carefully empty expression. The king will speak with you when the time is right. The king. Caelan Dusk. Even his name felt like something heavy and cold being set on a table in front of you. Not a threat. Just a fact. The way a mountain is a fact. The way winter is a fact. The kind of thing that doesn't ask your permission to exist and doesn't particularly care whether you're ready for it. Sera had never seen him up close. Only twice from a distance, once in the main hall when she'd been escorted through it, and once from her window when he'd crossed the courtyard below. Both times she had felt it before she saw him. A change in the air. Like the pressure dropping before a storm. He was tall in the way that kings who have never been challenged grow tall, unhurried, upright, taking up space as though the space had always belonged to him. His hair was dark and his jaw was set, and even from 40 feet above him Sera had noticed the way every person in the courtyard found something else to look at when he passed. Not from fear, exactly. From a kind of instinctive deference. The lowering of the head. The step back. The held breath. Wolves recognizing their alpha. Sera was not a wolf. She was an omega. Not the kind of omega that romance stories dressed up in soft meaning, but the real kind, the kind that meant she sat at the very bottom of the pack hierarchy with no wolf form, no standing, no protection, and no particular reason for a king to have any interest in her whatsoever. Which made the past 3 months deeply, horribly confusing. She had been brought here from the border settlement where she'd grown up, not kidnapped, technically, which was the part that kept tripping her. There had been palace officials. There had been paperwork. There had been a perfectly polite explanation that the king required her presence for reasons that would be explained in due time. Her protests had been heard and noted and completely ignored. And now here she was. Month 3. Still waiting for due time to arrive. She had decided, around week 6, that she would stop waiting. The plan had taken 10 weeks to build. Not because it was complicated, but because Sera understood something that most people who planned escapes forgot: the plan was never the hard part. The hard part was the timing. The hard part was being patient enough to wait for the exact right crack in the routine, the exact night when the variables aligned, and not moving a single breath before that moment arrived. Week 14. Moonless sky. The new guard rotation, 2 hours into their shift, not yet tired but past the sharp alertness of the first hour. The servant girl in the east corridor who always took her dinner break at the same time, leaving a 12-minute gap. Tonight. Sera had been lying still for 2 hours, fully dressed under her blankets, her heartbeat slow and controlled. She was good at stillness. You learned that when you were small and powerless and the only weapon you had was the ability to be overlooked. At the third bell of the night, she moved. The east corridor was empty. The 12-minute gap was holding. She moved low and quick through the servant passages she had memorized from watching, not exploring. She'd never been given the chance to explore. She knew where the treasury was. She'd overheard it mentioned. Something valuable enough to trade for a horse and a head start was all she needed. Not greed. Just survival. The third door on the left after the iron staircase. Except the third door on the left after the iron staircase was not the treasury. She didn't know that until she was already inside, the door closed behind her, her eyes adjusting to the faint blue light that seemed to come from the room itself. It was small. Smaller than she expected. And almost entirely empty. No gold. No jewels. No stacks of coin. Just a single circular table at the center of the room, and on it a velvet box, and inside the box, resting against black fabric like something sleeping. A ring. Dark silver. Ancient-looking, with markings carved so fine they almost looked like they'd grown there rather than been cut. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Even Sera, who knew nothing about jewelry or metalwork, understood that this was not a decorative piece. This was not something worn to impress. This was something worn to mean something. She should have left it. Some part of her knew that, the way you know when you're standing at the edge of something that can't be undone. Her hand reached out anyway, because voices were rising somewhere in the corridor outside, because the 12 minutes were running out, because she had come too far to leave empty-handed and she had no other options and she was afraid. Her fingers closed around the ring. It was warm. Which made no sense. It had been sitting in a velvet box in an empty room, but it was warm, almost feverishly so, and the moment her skin made contact with the metal she felt something that she had no word for. A pull. Not physical. Deeper than physical. Like a string she hadn't known existed, tugged from somewhere in the center of her chest. She yanked her hand back. Stared at it. The voices were getting closer. She jammed the ring onto her finger to hide it, just for now, just until she was out, and pulled her sleeve down over her hand and ran. The forest was 3 miles east of the palace walls and Sera ran all 3 of them. She was not athletic. She was not powerful. She was a small, underfed girl who had spent 3 months in comfortable captivity and her lungs were burning and her legs were shaking and she didn't care because the trees were ahead of her, dark and enormous and hers, she was almost there, She felt it when she crossed the first line of trees. Not the ring. Not the pull. Something else. Something that moved through her body like a wave of warm water, starting at her hand and spreading through her chest, her throat, her face. She stumbled. Caught herself on a trunk. Stood there breathing, one hand pressed to her sternum, confused. "What is this?" she whispered. Her voice disappeared into the dark. And somewhere far behind her, in a room she would never enter, at the end of a corridor she had never been allowed to walk down, a man woke from a dead sleep and sat upright in the dark with his heart slamming against his ribs. Caelan Dusk had not felt his wolf surface in 4 years. Not truly. Not the way it surfaced now, unbidden, uncontrolled, his vision shifting gold at the edges and a sound coming from his own throat that was not quite human. He pressed his hands flat against the mattress. Breathed. The bond. Someone had activated the Obsidian Seal. He said nothing for a long moment. Just sat there in the dark with the impossible reverberating through him. The seal had sat in that vault for 3 generations of his family, inert. Untouched. No woman had ever held it. No mate had ever been chosen. He could feel her. Not clearly, not the way a completed bond would feel, warm and specific and layered. Just a direction and a heat. East. Moving. Sorellen was dressed and out the door in less time than it took his guards to realize he was moving. He didn't take anyone with him. She heard nothing. That was the worst part. No crack of a branch. No rustle of leaves. Just the sudden, absolute certainty that she was not alone, the kind that bypassed thought and went straight to the spine, every hair on her arms standing up, her body already turning before her mind caught up. He was standing at the edge of the tree line. Not between her and the palace. Between her and everything else. Just standing there in the dark wearing no crown, no armor, nothing ceremonial, just dark clothing and an expression she couldn't read and eyes that caught the starlight and gave it back wrong. Gold. His eyes were gold. Sera went completely still. Some animal part of her, the part that had no pride and no bravery and only wanted to survive, recognized immediately that there was no running from this. Sorellen did not speak. He looked at her face, and then his gaze dropped, slow and deliberate, to her hand. Her right hand, where her sleeve had ridden up during the run. Where the ring sat on her finger. The silence between them stretched out. It had a texture to it, that silence. Something electric and terrible and, she hated herself for thinking it, not entirely made of fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Quieter than she expected from a man who had just run 3 miles through the dark. "You're wearing the seal." Sera lifted her chin. Her heart was hammering. "I was going to return it." A pause. Something moved across his expression. She couldn't name it, didn't have enough information about his face to read it. "That is not what the seal means," he said. "I don't know what the seal means. I was escaping." Another pause. Longer. "I know," he said. And then, with a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere far older than either of them, "That doesn't change what you've done." He didn't reach for her. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood there in the dark with his wolf-gold eyes and his impossible stillness, and Sera understood, with a cold clarity that settled over her like snow, that she was not going back to the guest wing. Something had changed. She just didn't know yet how much. "What did I do?" she asked. Sorellen looked at her for a long moment. And then said the word that would rewrite the next months of her life in handwriting she hadn't agreed to. "You chose me." The trees stood silent around them. The night held its breath. And Sera, who had run 3 miles toward freedom, felt something she had no name for settle warm and permanent in her chest. Right next to the terror. Sera had a theory about powerful men. They didn't need to threaten you. They didn't need to raise their voices or slam doors or make promises about what would happen if you disobeyed. The truly dangerous ones, the ones who had been obeyed for so long that obedience had become the natural order of things around them, like gravity, like weather, those men simply existed in a way that made resistance feel not impossible, but pointless. Caelan Dusk was that kind of man. He had not put her in a cell. He had not restrained her wrists or taken the ring from her finger or issued any formal declaration of what she now was to him. He had simply walked her back through the forest and through the palace gates and up the stairs, not the east stairs she'd used to escape, but the central ones, the grand ones, the ones that everyone could see, and he had opened a door and said, quietly, "This is your room now," and left. It was not the guest wing. It was the floor below his. Sera had stood in the center of the new room for a long time after he left, turning slowly, taking inventory the way she always took inventory of spaces, exits, windows, distance to the ground, what could be used as a weapon, what could be used as a rope. Old habit. The kind you developed when you had spent your whole life in places where leaving was something you had to plan for rather than simply do. 2 windows. 3rd floor. Too high to drop without injury. 1 door, she tried it. Unlocked. She opened it, stepped into the corridor, and found a guard she had never seen before standing 6 feet away with the professional blankness of someone who had been told exactly where to stand and had no opinions about it. She went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed. Unlocked door. Guard in the corridor. The cage had simply changed shape. She learned his patterns the way she had learned everything useful in her life, by watching and saying very little. Sorellen was awake before dawn. She knew because she could hear, faintly, through the ceiling above her, the sound of movement at an hour when everyone else in the palace was still. He trained in the inner courtyard in the early mornings. She discovered this on the third day when she couldn't sleep and stood at her window and watched him move through the grey pre-light below, alone, with the controlled precision of someone who had been doing the same thing for 20 years and no longer needed to think about it. He ate once in the morning and once in the evening. He held audiences in the main hall 3 days out of 7. He spent the other 4 in meetings she couldn't observe, in rooms she didn't have access to, making the kinds of decisions that kings made while everyone else just lived inside the consequences. He was, she noted with irritation, not what she'd expected. She had expected cold in the way that cruelty is cold, sharp, deliberate, interested in the harm it caused. What she found instead was cold in the way that distance is cold. He was not unkind. He was simply elsewhere. Even when he was standing directly in front of her, which happened more often now than it had in 3 months of the guest wing, there was a quality to his attention that felt like looking at someone through glass. Present. Contained. Translated into a version of himself that nothing could quite reach. On the 4th evening he appeared in the doorway of her room. She was sitting at the window with a book she wasn't reading, and she didn't turn around. "You haven't eaten," he said. "I wasn't hungry." A pause. "You haven't eaten since this morning." She turned then, because the fact that he knew that was more alarming than the statement itself. She looked at him in the doorway. He never came inside, she'd noticed, always the threshold, always that careful distance, and said, "Are you monitoring me?" "I'm aware of you," he said, as though this were a different thing. She wanted to argue that it wasn't. Instead she said, "I'm fine." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that she was still learning how to read, then turned and said something in a low voice to someone outside the door she couldn't see. 20 minutes later a tray appeared. He was gone by then. She ate every bite, which annoyed her. The bond was getting worse. That was the only word she had for it, worse, though part of her understood, reluctantly, that worse was not quite accurate. Stronger, maybe. More insistent. Like a frequency that had been too low to hear at first and was now climbing into range. It started as warmth. A general, low heat that lived in her sternum and spiked when he was near. She'd felt it the night of the escape and dismissed it as fear, as adrenaline, as the body doing what the body did under stress. But it didn't behave like fear. Fear was cold and sharp and narrowing. This was something else. Something that spread rather than contracted, that rose when she heard his voice from down the corridor, that made her hands want to reach for something she didn't have a name for. She hated it with a ferocity that surprised even her. The ring wouldn't come off. She'd tried, the morning after the failed escape, quietly and without panic, because she was not going to panic about a piece of jewelry. It had gone on easily enough, just slid onto her finger in that dark room without any resistance at all. But now, when she pulled at it, it didn't hurt exactly, it just didn't move. As though it had decided it was staying and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She'd wrapped her hand in a cloth and told herself she'd try again later. She had not tried again. She didn't examine why. It was Marin who finally told her something true. Marin was Sorellen's head guard. A tall, quiet woman with iron-grey eyes and the kind of posture that made you understand immediately that she had never in her life apologized for taking up space. She had been assigned, ostensibly, to accompany Sera during the periods when she was allowed to walk the palace grounds. In practice, she spoke approximately 4 words per outing and radiated the particular energy of someone performing a duty they found beneath them. Sera had respected this about her, initially. She'd always trusted people who didn't try to fill silence with noise. On the 9th day, Marin spoke first. They were in the inner garden, Sera's one real freedom, this small walled space with its dead winter roses and its cold stone benches, and Sera was feeding scraps she'd saved from breakfast to a wolf pup that had appeared at the garden wall 2 days prior. She didn't know where it had come from. She knew better than to ask. "You know the history of the seal," Marin said. Not a question. Sera looked up. "I know nothing about it." Marin was quiet for a moment, looking at the pup. Then, the last woman who wore it refused the bond. Sera waited. "She didn't survive the winter," Marin said. Simply. No cruelty in it, no theater. Just a fact, laid down like a stone. "Was that a threat?" Sera asked. It was history. Those aren't always different things. Something almost like respect moved across Marin's face. No, she agreed. They're not. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. The words sat with Sera for the rest of the day, turning over and over in her mind like a stone in water, the edges wearing smooth but the weight staying exactly the same. That evening, she heard Sorellen's footsteps stop outside her door and she said, before he could speak, "Come in." A pause. First time. He always spoke from the threshold. He came in. He didn't sit. Stood near the window with his arms at his sides, and waited. The light from the lamps made his face look different, less granite, more something she didn't have a word for. Sera sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap and looked at the ring on her finger and said, "I stole it." The room went quiet in a way that was different from regular quiet. "I was in the wrong room," she continued, and her voice was steady, steadier than she had expected. "I was trying to escape. I grabbed the first thing I saw that looked valuable. I didn't know what it was. I put it on to hide it and I ran." She paused. "I didn't choose you. I didn't choose anything. I was scared and I made a bad decision, and I am telling you this because," her voice broke, just slightly, and she hated it. "Because I need you to understand that whatever you think happened that night, it wasn't that. It wasn't a choice." The silence stretched. She forced herself to look up at him. Sorellen was standing very still with an expression she had never seen on him before, something open and almost young in it, something that looked like pain being held at a precise and careful distance from the surface. His jaw was set. His eyes were dark, not gold, just dark, just human and complicated and harder to read than the wolf. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to the window. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I know you were afraid," he said at last. Quietly. "Then you know it wasn't a choice." Another pause. When he turned back, something in his expression had shifted. Closed slightly, the way a shutter closes against weather, not quite hiding, just protecting. "Then why," he said, and his voice was so low she almost didn't catch it, "haven't you taken it off?" Sera opened her mouth. Closed it. Looked down at her hand. The ring sat there on her finger, dark silver and ancient and warm, always warm, and she had no answer. She had wrapped it in cloth and told herself she'd try again. She had not tried again. She had told herself it was because it wouldn't move, because the magic held it, because she had no choice. But sitting there in the lamplight with his question hanging in the air between them, she was not sure that was entirely true. And she had never, in her life, been someone who lied to herself. The silence had a different quality now. Not hostile. Not safe. Something trembling and unresolved and far more dangerous than either. "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said since she arrived. Sorellen looked at her for one more long moment. Then he nodded, once, small, like he was filing something away, and walked to the door. He paused at the threshold. "The pup," he said. "You can keep it." He left. Sera sat in the silence and pressed both hands flat against her sternum and felt the warmth there, steady, insistent, infuriating, and did not know whether she wanted to scream or weep or simply stop pretending that what was happening in her chest had nothing to do with him. The ring stayed on. She let it. She woke on the morning of the 20th day and the door was open. Not the door to the corridor, she meant the gate. She found out by accident, the way you find out things in palaces, through fragments. A servant passing too quickly. A change in the energy of the guards who usually flanked the main entrance. She went to the high window at the end of her corridor and looked down on the palace gate, the enormous iron gate she had stared at through every window for 5 months, the one that had always been staffed and sealed and permanently, deliberately shut against her, was standing open. She stared at it for a long time. Then she went to find Marin. She saw the moment he recognized it. Something shifted in his expression, the comfortable arrogance sharpening into something more focused and considerably more dangerous. "The seal," he said. Out loud. To no one in particular. "The way you say something when you're thinking fast." And then, to her, "You're his mate." It wasn't a question. And the way he said it, not with admiration, not with deference, but with the calculating brightness of a man who had just spotted an advantage, made something in Sera's chest go cold and hard. "Come here," Veth said, pleasantly. Sera did not move. "I'm asking politely," he said. "I don't always ask politely." "That's very interesting," Sera said. "No." The courtyard went very still. And then, from behind her, she felt it, the shift in pressure, the change in the air, the particular quality of attention that always preceded him. She had learned it the way you learned weather. The storm feeling. Sorellen moved past her. He didn't touch her. He placed himself, with absolute precision, between her and Veth, and the way he did it, not rushed, not dramatic, simply immovable, said everything about the geometry of what was happening. She was behind him. Veth was in front of him. The arrangement was not accidental. What happened next was fast and ugly and nothing like the stories. She had expected, perhaps, some formal exchange. Declarations. The measured rituals of powerful men establishing territory. What she got instead was violence at close range, Veth's men moving, Sorellen's guard moving to meet them, and Veth himself dismounting with a sword drawn and a smile that hadn't changed, which was somehow the worst part of it. Sorellen fought without armor. Without ceremony. With the particular focused brutality of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. She watched him take a strike across the shoulder that would have put another person on the ground and not go down. She watched him disarm Veth's second with an efficiency that had no anger in it, just physics, just the inevitable outcome of superior force and absolute calm. She watched him face Veth directly with blood on his sleeve and gold back in his eyes and not one syllable of performance in his posture. And she understood something, standing there. She had spent 5 months looking at Caelan Dusk through the glass of her own fear, her own anger, her own desperate need to see him as simply the obstacle between her and freedom. She had catalogued his coldness and his control and his impossible certainty. She had noted his possessiveness and his silences and the way he occupied space like a fact rather than a person. She had not let herself see this. That he had opened the gate this morning. That he had told her, without words, that she was free, and then walked out here alone when the threat came, without calling her back, without using her, without making her presence his justification. He had stepped in front of her not as a king protecting his property but as something she had no safe or managed word for. Something that made her feet move. She was walking before she decided to walk. She reached the center of the courtyard and stepped forward, not between them, not stupidly, but to his side, her chin up, her right hand visible with the ring on it, and looked at Veth with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed and said, "I'm not leverage." Veth looked at her. Then at the ring. Then back at Sorellen. Something in his calculation shifted. He stepped back. Not in defeat, not yet, this wasn't over, but in the way a man steps back when the numbers change. When the thing he thought was an exposed weakness turns out to be something else. He looked at the two of them standing there, and whatever he had expected to find in this courtyard this morning, it was not this. "We'll speak again," Veth said. "Probably," Sorellen said. Veth rode out. His column followed. The courtyard emptied slowly. Guards dispersing, servants reappearing, the palace reassembling itself around the space that the confrontation had briefly hollowed out. Someone appeared with cloth for Sorellen's shoulder and he let them work on it with the detached patience of a man who had been patched up before and had no feelings about it. Sera stood nearby and did not leave. When the servants were gone and they were alone in the cold morning air, she said, "You opened the gate." "Yes," he said. "Before you knew Veth was coming." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. The wolf gold had faded from his eyes, leaving them dark and human and complicated. "Because the seal was never meant to bind the person who wears it," he said at last. His voice was measured, careful, the voice of someone choosing words with more precision than usual because the words matter. "That's not what it does. That's not what it's for." Sera waited. "It was made for the Alpha," he said. "It reveals who he would choose. Not who he owns. Who he would be, vulnerable with. Who he would open the gate for." A pause. "I had not been able to choose anyone in 4 years. And then you came in and stole it in the dark and put it on your finger, and the seal activated, and I understood something." "What?" she asked. Very quietly. He looked at her. That I had already chosen, he said. Before you touched it. The cold morning air sat between them. Sera's chest ached with something she no longer wanted to pretend was anything other than what it was. She looked at the ring on her finger, warm, always warm, as patient as something that had never doubted the outcome, and thought about 5 months of caged silk and unlocked doors and a question she had never properly answered. Why haven't you taken it off? She took a breath. Because it didn't feel wrong, she said. Finally. Honestly. The words cost her something to say, she could feel the cost of them, the weight of what she was putting down, but they came out clean and whole and true. It felt wrong to be held here. It felt wrong to have no choice. But the ring, she stopped. Started again. The ring felt like something I'd had for longer than one night. And I didn't know how to explain that. And I was afraid of what it meant. Sorellen looked at her for a long time. And now, he said. Same question he'd asked weeks ago, the night she'd confessed. Same voice. But different, less careful now, less glass, something real and breakable showing through the cracks. Sera looked at the open gate. The road. The cold grey freedom she had wanted so badly she'd memorized guard rotations and counted minutes and slept fully dressed for weeks. She looked at him. Now I think, she said slowly, that there's a difference between a gate being locked and a gate being closed. She met his eyes. I couldn't tell the difference before. I think I can now. She held his gaze. I'm not staying because the bond holds me, she said. I'm not staying because I'm afraid. I'm not staying because a ring on my finger made a decision for me. She took one step forward. I'm staying because I'm choosing to. The word landed between them the same way his had in the forest, chose, settling with the permanence of something that had been true before it was said. Sorellen looked at her and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was not possession. It was something more careful and more frightened and more human than either of those things. He reached out. His hand came up, slowly, and his fingers closed gently around her hand, the one with the ring, not taking it, not holding it captive, just holding it. Warm. Steady. Like an answer. Sera let him. Outside, the road stretched empty and cold through the silver trees. Somewhere in the garden, a wolf pup was probably knocking over her breakfast tray. The gate stood open behind them, still open, always hers to walk through. She didn't walk through it. She stayed. Not because she had been kept. Not because she had been claimed. But because she had finally understood what she had known since the night she stood in the dark and slid a stolen ring onto her finger and felt something ancient and warm settle into her chest like a thing coming home. That freedom was not the absence of where you were. It was the presence of where you chose to be. The ring stayed warm. It always would.